All right, let's talk about mergers and acquisitions. Okay, so pull out the framework sheet. Let me walk you through the framework. Actually quite straightforward, actually. This is what I call the mergers and acquisitions fit framework, and it's generally used when company A is deciding whether company B is the right, amongst the companies available to be acquired, is company B the right one to acquire? Okay? It is less about, is it worth acquiring someone in general, in terms of trying to change the industry capacity. It's more about, is this target, particular target, make sense? Okay? And the easiest way to understand this, I mean, it really is just a variation of the business situation framework. So M&A, and I'm using slide E here. M&A is, it's still my four key areas: customers, products, company, and competition. Ran out of space here. And essentially what I'm doing conceptually is we have company A, which is the potential acquirer, company B, and then the combined new company. Okay. And the general rule of thumb is you sort of go through the exact same process we did earlier, but for each individual company, and you sort of synthesize, you add up what the combined entities would look like. Most common M&A situations are, well, there tend to be in one of two categories. One is complementary assets. So a classic situation is young company has hot brand new product, okay, but very limited distribution. Old company has like the biggest sales force on planet Earth, but their products stink. Okay, so it's like, well, you could just take the product from product A, company B, move it to the acquiring company, pump it right into the sales force, and boom, they got the hottest product in the market with the best distribution. Wouldn't that be great? So conceptually, that's how it typically works. The other areas, actually, those are the ones I like, just separate from the case. Those are the ones I think make the most sense, right? So an obvious synergy where the two combined are worth a lot more together than apart. Other areas of synergy are around internal cost overlap. So you got a big company, I got a big company. We each have like an HR department that spends $50 million a year. We only need one. So we can sort of combine the two companies, strip out, and have one department and say $50 million a year. And that tends to be more on the cost side, but you know, you can't shrink to greatness, right? So that's sort of just one area to look at. And so I'll give you as one example. Let me see if I got all the points here. Yeah. Make sense so far? Okay. The case I want to give and demonstrate, since we're on the topic of media anyway, is there's this fictitious company. It's an advertising agency, so global brand advertising agency serving consumer packaged goods companies. And I'm going to call them Omega and Omega. Okay? You can speculate who they are. And Omega, they are a billion-dollar company, roughly, and their sales are flat. Okay? Their sales are flat past 3 years in a row. And they contact your firm and want you to help them. Help us fix this problem. We need growth. We're flat 3 years in a row. What should we do? Okay. And actually, you know what? This case was sort of assuming I did an earlier case, which I skipped. Okay. So let me, I'll give you the answer to the prior case. Omega and Omega, they, well, how much time do we have? 2 o'clock. Actually, I'll do the whole thing. Okay. I'll go through sort of the business situation framework for Omega, and I'm going to tell you in advance it's going to end up evolving to an M&A case, so you can sort of see how that flows. And I'll try to point out some ahas that would trigger the thought that it should be an M&A. Okay. Okay. Omega, flat sales. Actually, this will be even better. We'll use all the frameworks. Even better. Gosh, I'm so excited. So I'm on slide F here. So we are talking about Omega and Omega. Profits are flat at 0%. To understand why profits are flat, we would need to look at revenues and costs. And it turns out there's been no change in cost, and there's been no change in revenue. And then the next question then is, okay, well, what are the components of revenue? You know, do we know if there's a change in revenue per account, let's say? Or the number of accounts. Okay. And it turns out the account growth has been flat, and the revenue per account has been flat. Okay. So that's interesting. So really no real change. So next question is, what's happening to the market overall? Right? So one of the things on the checklist on the original profitability framework. And it turns out that, and usually when I sort of do comparisons, I like to start with the most general number first, and then break down. So if you're sort of down and you realize, okay, I need an industry comparison, it's often better to sort of jump up a level, because it's less math that way. Okay? So I'd say, that's interesting. I would say out loud probably. And I wonder if this is a company-specific issue or an industry-wide issue. And then I would probably say, do we have information on whether profits for the advertising industry overall has changed or not? Is it going up, is it flat, or is it decline? Okay. And so this pen here. So this is sort of industry. Okay. I see this, right? Industry, and O and O. Okay. Because it's, well, two reasons. One sort of practical and one sort of just because. One is I know the answer, is sort of the real answer. And the other one, probably, if the way the question was phrased is they want to grow faster. And so if costs are flat and they haven't changed, then if I know cost better, I still can't grow it. So I need either a pricing improvement or I need unit improvement. So that was sort of why I sort of gravitated towards that. And I didn't have any data there, so I wanted to, you know, as an industry, shift it over that way. And so let's say, so if we look at profits overall, omega and omega is flat, industry is growing at 5%. Okay? Well, that's interesting. So obviously we're doing something different than the industry overall. That's my aha. Okay? All right, so it's not clearly just a company-specific profitability problem. There's something going on different in the industry overall. Profitability framework won't cut it. Okay? So I'm going to switch. So I'll leave this over here. Now I'm going to go into slide G here. And I am going to do the business situation framework. Because I'm like, what the hell is going on? I have no idea. Something weird's going on. Okay? And to understand what's going on for omega and its industry, we need to look at 4 key areas. We need to look at the customers, the products, the company itself, and competitors. Okay, now in this particular situation, I have some data, an insight, that there is some difference between what the company is doing and the competition. Okay? So I would probably, in this case, be tempted to start there. And we can pull that one out. Okay. So if we look on our checklist, the first question I would ask is, who are the major categories of competitors and what's the concentration of market share? Okay. And so let's say there, in this case, the interviewer might say, well, there are 4 classes, I think, of advertising agencies. Okay, that's a segmentation, right? And they are global ad agencies, direct response media agencies. I'll explain what those are in a second. and digital advertising, and then media buying. Okay, great. And I would ask sort of a clarifying question. So what is a direct response agency? They do like direct mail. Oh, okay, got it. Digital ads, they sort of do online advertising. Is that right? Yes, that's right. What's this media buying thing? Well, the way the ad agency business works, you got people who create ads, you got people who buy ad space. They tend to split it up. So there's specialists who buy ad space, and there's specialists who create ads. Okay? Got it. So that's what it looks like. So I'm looking at the competition concentration. So like, what's the mix? Like, what percentage of the total pie do each of these people have? You know, and we know in total it's 100%. And let's say, I don't know, media buying's, I don't know, 20%. The global ad agencies, 50%. We'll call this 20% and 10%. Okay? Okay, so it's fairly concentrated, at least that category within global ad agencies. Roughly how many are there? Like 4 or 5. Okay, got it. Sort of a oligopoly-ish kind of structure. Okay, so the next thing is around competitors and their behaviors. So we would like to know more about each of the categories of competitors. We know what the mix is, and so since we have this unusual situation where our company has flat growth, but the industry overall has 5% growth, we want to know where the growth is coming from. Okay? So I'd say, well, now that we understand what the competitive situation looks like, I'd like to understand what the profit is. We know overall it's 5%, but by segment, what's the profitability growth for each of the major segments? Okay? So this is sort of market share, and this is growth rate of profits. Okay? Turns out all global ad agencies are, in fact, actually shrinking. Okay? So overall, the segment our client is in is actually shrinking a little bit, so they actually outperform by here. Okay? Direct response is growing at, is also flat. Media buying is flat, and digital advertising is growing at 30% per year. That's an aha. Okay. Aha, interesting. So really, it's not the industry overall that's profits increasing. It's really a particular segment within the industry that's really driving the overall numbers. So what we really have to figure out is what's going on there with digital advertising. Okay. Now I'd say, aha, now this is a time where I have the aha, I understand what's going on on the competitive side. Now I want to know why digital advertising is growing so fast. And this is when I'm inclined to switch over to the customer branch. Okay? So I am temporarily leaving best practices, barriers to entry, supplier concentration, all that, because I have some information that suggests another issue is far more relevant, is why are these customers giving these guys so much money so quickly when everyone else is getting none of it? Okay? So that's when my decision is to switch. So the way I would transition, I say, it's interesting, it looks like the customers are really driving the increase in digital advertising growth. It's the only segment that's sort of profitable on an increasing basis. It looks like we need to better understand what's going on with customers. So I'm going to switch gears, unless we have any other information, I'm going to switch gears and talk more about the customers. And the interviewer might say, that sounds like a reasonable plan to me, why don't you go ahead and do that? Okay? Or they might sort of prompt you and say, give you some feedback saying, no, not quite yet, and ask you to go further. That's fine too. But I think in this case, it would be reasonable to switch over. Okay, that's talking about the customers. So who are the customers, right? What are their segments? And let's look at the growth rates for each segment. So that's the first question on the checklist. So let me get a new slide. What is this? That's G. So that's E, F, G. That must be H. Okay. So I'll use slide H here. And we're going to look at customers. And I would like to say, okay, so what I'd like to know more about the customers overall and what are the major segments. Okay? And the interviewer might say, well, here's what we do know. There are, let's see, Fortune 500 sort of brand managers, if you would, brand companies, so like a P&G. Okay? Let's see who else. They're sort of mid-market. and I don't know, small business. Okay, that's interesting. And what percentage of ad dollars does sort of belong to each segment? Okay. And it turns out, so sort of share of spending. The big P&G kind of companies out there are spending 70%, mid-market is 20%, I don't know, small business is 10%. So it's probably not right by making that. Okay, so really the bulk of the market is being driven by the large multinational companies. Okay, just out of curiosity, what is the change in spending across all of these segments? So total ad dollars. Actually, this math's going to work out. All right, my math isn't going to tie perfectly. Yeah, go ahead, question.
Sorry, for the numbers that
Yeah.
you do some data on,
Yes.
are the interviewers going to give it to you, or are they?
Yes, they will tell you.
Because sometimes when we do market share kind of analysis, and we're asked to assume a lot of numbers.
That's fine too. Sometimes in real life you don't know, right?
And I guess I'm having trouble like coming up with like close assumptions, because sometimes I really have no idea what the industry is about, and the interviewer says just go ahead, think, and I'm like.
Oh, really? I never had that. So, so they told you to make up a number, basically?
Well, yeah, so they're like, okay, so if you want to think about like the overall size of dining services in college campuses, and you're like, they wanted me to assume kind of like how many universities, or like.
Sounds a little bit more like an estimation question.
Yes.
Okay, that's different. So on an estimation question, that's more testing your ability to, well, estimate. And it's less about finding the business implications of the data. That I have done a lot to others, and I have been on the receiving end. And that's less about sort of business judgment analysis. It's more about sort of computational flexibility. Okay? In those situations, that's a entirely different kind of problem. If we have time at the end, happy to walk through that. Wasn't planning on it originally. Some other resources that are available that sort of cover that topic fairly well. The book Case in Point is one of them. So back to here, my numbers aren't going to tie up, but if you don't hold me to that, I'm going to say that, let's see, share of spending, what was my next question? So share of spending and change rate, right? So let's say it's all flat. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. How does that work? Okay, something must be going on. So now I'm sort of like thinking I'm sort of stuck, okay? When you're stuck, and like, that seems odd. Something doesn't seem right. I'm clearly not understanding something. Golden rule: when in doubt, segment. When in doubt, segment. I mean, that sort of saved my butt a lot of times. Okay? So we segment the thing that's biggest, right? Because obviously it has the most leverage. If the small business market changed a lot, it's such a small percentage, it makes no big difference on the aggregate number. So I'm going to say, well, this is really interesting. Clearly something unusual is going on here. I like to sort of break out the Fortune 500 multinational companies and segment that and look at what are the subsegments within that customer segment, and then also I'd like to look at whether their ad spending has changed or not. And so we are going to split out the Fortune 500, and this is where you say, I want to segment, and then you sort of shut up, and they'll tell you how to segment, right? Because a lot of ways you could segment. And so they're going to say, well, there's, yeah. Literally just what I said. I would say, clearly, okay, I'm not sure what's going on here, but something's very odd. How can you have one type of competitor who's growing 30% per year when the overall market's flat? The big companies seems to be fairly flat. So, gosh, I'm puzzled. Okay. Yes.
Here, the percentage of shared spending is not changing, but it may be the case that the revenue is going up. So in the end, the absolute amount goes up. So how do you know that you need to segment, or it's because of the fact that their revenues are going up? You know what I mean?
Yes. So the question is, in this particular situation, you could have a segment of competitors whose revenues are increasing, but it could be related or unrelated to the fact that ad spending has or has not changed. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, what we are trying to decide is the total spending their percentage of spending remains the same. So this may be either because of the different segments of that, Fortune 500 is spending more, some of them spending less, or it may be the case that all of them are their revenues are going up, but the percentage of revenue spending on advertising remains the same.
I got you. So, good point.
And how do you know that you need to go to the segmentation part versus maybe that all of them their revenues are going up? You don't know that. So
I would probably, I probably would ask, and because this is a percentage basis, right? To your point, so maybe the absolute dollars are changing. That's a fair point, and I would probably, in hindsight, I would probably ask for absolute numbers rather than percentages. So I get the percentage because I want to know which segment's largest, and then I would probably at some point realize I have to get absolute numbers because I don't know, because it could be one of those two things. So I'd say, okay, now that I understand that this is the biggest segment, let's look at total ad dollars spent, for this. And so let's say that's, I don't know, we'll call it for total ad spend by segment, let's call it 4 billion. And there are two segments. There are the Fortune 500 sort of brand divisions, and then the Fortune 500, I don't know, interactive, okay? And interactive is $1 billion, brand is $3 billion, okay? And so that's interesting. And I'm curious, in terms of the total, how has that changed versus the previous years on absolute dollars, right? And then you're going to say, well, it's actually been fairly steady the past 3 years. Okay? So that's interesting. So then, within the segments, how have numbers changed? And they might say, well, in the Fortune 500 brand division, the brand divisions of the Fortune 500 companies, that's been shrinking. So that used to be $3.5 billion, 2 years ago, and this year it's only $3 billion. And it's basically been moving from traditional media to interactive. Okay. All right. So we know ad spending for the interactive divisions are going up, and the ad spending on the traditional Fortune 500 brand managers is going down. So I probably would say, I would synthesize at this point. Okay, that's interesting. So it looks like from a industry standpoint, the companies that are doing the best are the ones that are offering digital advertising services. That seems to be the only fast-growing segment. If you look at the customer side, on the demand side, overall demand for ad spending has been fairly flat, and there's actually been a big shift, fairly rapidly, I might add, between sort of traditional advertising towards online interactive advertising. Okay? And if I wanted, as an interviewer, to push this to an M&A situation, I would say, great, that seems like a reasonable conclusion. Now what would you recommend to the client? Okay. And that would be a way to force it to more of an M&A type of situation. Or I'd let it keep going. And so we could sort of explore things more and figure out what's changing. So there are things around product issues, potentially. So interactive advertising is a different kind of product than traditional. You can understand why. There's lots of things you sort of make up there. But I'll sort of speed it up a little bit so we can get more onto the M&A side. And so I would say, let's see, go back to my framework here. Okay, I'm going to keep on going on the customer stuff because there's a couple more insights I want to pull out. Okay. So the question at this point now is so we understand interactive advertising in the global Fortune 500 is really driving the shift on the demand side and on the supply side. Like, why is it happening? So we just keep going down the framework on, let's see, on the business situation framework. So, what does each customer segment want? The interviewer might say, well, the Fortune 500 companies, they're very media-centric towards traditional media. So newspaper, print media, television, and radio. Okay? And the interactive agencies, obviously, they're sort of very, very geared towards two things. One is online media placement, and the other is they like sort of very measurable media. Okay? So where you can track responses. So they have a bent towards a lot of statistical analysis. Whereas the traditional media, they're more interested in like creativity, brand, building the emotional connection to customers. Okay, so that's interesting. And I might say at this point, well, let me back up for a second. For Omega, I just want to make sure I got this right. Omega is in a global ad brand agency. What is their mix of business? What percentage of media is through the various media types? and because I think it might be relevant, so I would draw this out and jump back over. And the interviewer might say, well, about 50% of their media spending from their clients is television, 25% is radio, and like 20% is radio, okay, and 5% interactive. Okay, interesting. So I would say, aha, right? That'd be an aha. And I would say, well, it looks like the problem is Omega, they are really strong in the area that customers are caring less and less about. It happens to be big today, but it's not where the growth is, and the customers are shifting towards interactive media. Okay? All right, let's see. Next issue would be on price. You know, what is each segment willing to pay? And if I were to ask that question, the interviewer might say, well, the standard commission for traditional media buyers, an ad agency is like 15% commission. So on a $100 million budget, the agency gets $15 million. Okay? Oh, that's interesting. Well, what about for the digital interactive agencies? Well, their commissions are higher. Okay, they get a 20% commission. Oh, interesting. Okay, so they're getting more money. That's probably what's driving the revenue growth of that segment, even though ad spending overall is fairly flat and in aggregate. It's a more profitable product, basically. Okay? And this is an actually interesting one. My sort of aha in formulation, which I haven't validated yet, is I'm wondering why they're shifting from traditional media to online media. Okay? Now, prior knowledge would say, well, it's because the internet's growing so fast, right? But I want to assume that. So I would say, that's interesting. I'm wondering what's driving this trend. Within this framework, within this analysis, I'm going to step out for a second, and I like to look at further down the stream in the industry. I want to look at viewership, okay? And I would be interested in knowing, amongst the 4 major media types, how has the viewership or the equivalent listenership, readership, how has that changed across the major media types? Okay? And the interviewer might say, well, we know in the major segments like television, radio, you know, radio, newspaper, and internet, the top 3 are flat, internet's growing, top 3 are shrinking, and internet's growing fast. So maybe internet's growing 30% per year, and all the other ones are shrinking, and in fact, that's actually what's happening today. Okay. So if I had heard that, I would say, aha, another aha, okay? So this is a structural shift being driven by viewers that's flowing through to advertisers who want to be where the people are, which is impacting the profitability of the agencies that are trying to serve these advertisers. Okay? So what's happening here is a structural shift, and you asked earlier about what happens when it's a market problem versus an internal problem. And this is exactly what, like that kind of situation. You have a structural shift in demand. Now the question is, what do you do about it? Okay? So as an interviewer, I would say that's an interesting, interesting sort of insight. What would you recommend to Omega? Okay? And let's see. Well, I'm going to hold off on that for a second. Okay, so basically now the question really is, the problem really is, the market's really changed to favor a segment that Omega is not in. What should Omega do about it? Okay. So now at this point, I kind of understand the demand drivers, what's demand, and now it's more about like what options does Omega have to sort of deal with this demand problem, because you can't really change the demand much, right? So now it's more like a how do we respond issue. So back to the original framework, I would say, okay, I think we have a good grasp on what customers are doing. What they're doing is they're just following their customers. And that's really it. And their customers are moving and shifting their viewership habits. So the advertisers are doing the same thing. So the question now is, what do we do about it? Well, what do we have? What assets do we have? Right? So what assets do we have that we can use? And then let's figure out how we can respond. So I'm going to jump over here and now look at the company, because it seems like if we have a good sense of what the company is capable of doing or not capable of doing, we have a better sense of what options they can use to respond to the market situation that has structurally changed. Okay. So let's talk about the company. First issue on the list is capabilities and expertise. What is Omega good at? Okay. Turns out they're very good at creating blockbuster television ads. Okay. Is what the interviewer might say. They're very good at creative media. They're very good at branding. They're very good at sort of the jingles and the slogans and sort of building brand new brands. Okay? It's interesting. And in terms of distribution channels, Omega has a a direct sort of sales force. They're constantly contacting the Fortune 500 accounts, which is fine. I might be tempted to jump back into customer and say, well, is there a difference in the channel preferences, right, for each of the segments? In this case, because I've been jumping around a little bit because of the ahas, I might have jumped too soon, right? Because next on the list, I would have had distribution channel preferences was one of the things on the checklist, but I sort of jumped back because I thought this was more important. Sometimes I'm wrong. And if you're wrong, you can switch back, but you got to be real clear about it, okay? So the way you would say that is, well, interesting. Just to double check, I think I know the answer, but let me double check. I want to make sure that of the two major segments in the customers and the advertisers, what distribution channels are they using for placing ads? Turns out they're using agencies. So, okay, all right, let's check. So we're sort of in the right ballpark. Okay, and at let's see. The insight I'm trying to drive towards is there's a mismatch between the capabilities of what Omega and Omega can do and what customers, the fastest growing customers really want. Okay? So I mentioned earlier that, that the interactive customers, they want online media placements and they want really good metrics that help really, they want basically math-driven marketing. Okay? And in this case, Omega wants creativity-driven marketing. That's what they're good at doing. So then the interviewer might say, well, what do you do? What do you tell Omega and Omega to do? Okay. Well, that's a big challenge, I think. So basically, if I had to summarize what's going on, Omega is facing a structural shift in market demand, yeah, where the segments Omega is strong in is shrinking, and the segments Omega is poor in is growing incredibly fast. Okay? So Omega is not positioned properly in the marketplace relative to new market demand. Okay? And in terms of recommendations, they got to be where the demand is. And I think you got one of two options typically. You either sort of build that capability internally or you go buy. Okay? And so while the interviewer might say, interesting insight, well, which would you suggest? Okay? Well, I might go back and look at the company more and look at the capabilities and really sort of hone in on what capabilities Omega has and then compare that to what customers want. And to just shorten the process, I'll just tell you, like what they're good at, the customers don't care about at all. Okay? So a total mismatch. Okay? These are great TV people, they hate TV. These are brand people, they hate brand. These are emotionally driven people, these are all like numerically driven people. Okay? Total polar opposites. Okay? So given that information, what do you suggest Omega and Omega do? So I'm sort of abbreviating certain parts of the case to get to the MA part. I would say, well, given that there's not just a skills mismatch between what Omega is good at and what customers want, it seems to be a sort of a cultural difference too. That the way Omega people tend to think about advertising is totally different than the numerically driven marketers that are interested in interactive advertising. So in that situation, I think the best option seems to be looking at an acquisition because to build it internally, it seems like it's too big of a leap. So I'd be looking towards looking at acquisition options and determining if there are any acquisition targets that would be worth considering. Okay, great. Let's talk about that more, the interviewer says. Okay, great. I thought the case was over, but I'll keep going because this is my third framework, right? And I would say, well, what would you suggest? Which companies should Omega potentially look at acquiring? Well, I'd like to actually do let's see. I guess that would be a competitor analysis. I would like to actually take the digital advertising segment that's growing at 30% year, and I would like to subsegment that into who are the key competitors. So basically, it's a competitor analysis all over again, right? So who are the key competitors and what's the market share differential between each of them? So there is, we'll call it, what do they call it? There's eQool advertising. There is SuperClick and I don't know, math ads. Okay. And together, I forget, what do we say? They're doing let's call it $1 billion. Okay. And so, okay, great. So we know what the three major competitors are, and let's call it everyone else. What's the market share structure look like? Okay. So eQool is doing 400 million. SuperClick is doing 200. Math Ads is doing 200, and everybody else is doing 200. Okay, that's interesting. And just out of curiosity, how many other companies are in the final category? Like 100. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. So we have a situation where Equal is the dominant player. We got sort of two mid-level players, and then we have everyone else that's sort of picking up all the pieces. And I might ask, well, just out of curiosity, how many people are in everyone else? 500. Okay, so it's very, very fragmented. So I would say, well, look, based on the market shares, well, I'd probably ask for growth rates too. Okay, so who's growing? Are they shrinking? And if I got growth rates too, and I ran out of space, unfortunately, let's just say all of them are growing, but Equal is growing the fastest. Okay. If I were to pull back up, I'd say, well, it looks like amongst the potential targets, the three top market share players might be a good fit. They're all growing fairly well. And geez, Equal looks fairly interesting because not only are they the biggest, but they're also growing the fastest. All right? Equal first. Great. Why don't you do that? What would you want to know? Okay? And this is where I go to that original M&A framework. So to summarize, the M&A framework, you're basically doing the business situation framework for each company independently and then adding the two together. Okay? And actually, when I've done this, I have not used this matrix, but it's actually not a bad idea. So I would say, well, for customers, for company A, which is Omega and Omega, and we're on slide E here, company A, Omega and Omega, O and O, and Equal. Okay. They have the Fortune 500 brand accounts. I would do the business situation analysis for Equal, and I would discover they have, their primary segment is the Fortune 500 sort of E accounts, all the interactive arms of these Fortune 500 companies. And so this is 80% of the business for Omega and Omega. This is 80% of the business for Equal. Okay. Okay. So I'd say that's interesting. There seems to be very little overlap. Okay. So that if Omega and Omega were to acquire Equal, they would in fact be getting a very big position in this fast-growing segment. Okay. So that seems interesting. I could do the same analysis around products, and the key products for Omega and Omega are sort of like TV, ads, focus groups, sort of brand concepts. The product set for Equal is, database marketing tools, statistical modeling, and then sort of online ad buys. Okay. So there's no overlap in products either. So you don't have to kill one of the products or anything like that. So they would be buying into a whole new category of products. Okay. I would probably just verify that the products that Equal has is in fact what customers want. I'm feeling pretty good about that because the revenue is so fast, but I'd probably double check. Okay. And it would turn out that they're producing exactly what those kind of customers want. That's why they're going so fast. Okay. So that's interesting. Let's see. Then in terms of the company, we know that Omega and Omega is one of the best in terms of sort of brand building, and Equal, as we analyze Equal, they are good at sort of online campaigns, obviously, and predictive analysis in terms of what customers are willing to buy based on data. So they have like PhDs, right? And whereas Omega and Omega has like artists, right? So it's very, very different. And then the question really is, okay, so if you combine, and obviously they're sort of facing the same competitive environment, so I probably won't go into that one. So now the question is, okay, so should Omega and Omega sort of acquire Equal? Would it be a good fit? And I would say, sort of purchase price aside, just looking at what each has to offer, the combined company looks pretty interesting. Okay? You take Omega Omega, which is tied for one of the largest market shares in its segment, has reached to all these major accounts. By picking up Equal, they get a much larger customer base with no overlap. Okay, so there's sort of no negative synergy, I guess. Like if you're buying a competitor that had the exact same accounts you did, you're not actually growing, right? Because you're just basically, it's the same, it's two sales forces reaching the same accounts, and so basically that becomes a cost savings play. Whereas here, you're actually incrementally getting new accounts. So your number of accounts goes up significantly. Okay? By the way, what I'm doing essentially, and you probably figured this out, is every time there's a good fit, it's sort of like check one box on the good idea list. Okay? Next is around products. By Omega buying into Equal, they're picking up products that they're terrible in, that the high growth customers really want. That seems like a good fit as well. In the company environment, the things that Omega are good at are very, very different than what Equal is good at, so it's a net positive overall. In addition, because Omega has access to so many more accounts, there's an opportunity to take these tools and sort of use that as a distribution channel. So that seems like a good fit. So I might say that overall, acquisition price aside, just from a fit, it seems like it's a good idea. The only issue I haven't talked about yet, so maybe I jumped to a conclusion too fast, is around the company itself. And particularly only really in M&A cases, cultural stuff becomes important. Actually, probably the number one reason why Fortune 500 mergers don't work, it's not because of the other things I talked about. It's usually because the people can't stand each other, right? And if they can't stand each other in a room, then usually sort of the business falls apart. So I might mention, I talk about that as a potential issue, okay? And say if you can address some of the potential cultural issues, if that indeed is an issue, it looks like there's a potential good fit here. Okay? Now the interviewer can do one of two things, okay? They can either say, well, great, well, let's talk about purchase price. And that becomes more of a math case. Or they can say, well, how would you minimize the cultural issues? Okay? And that might be more of an issue around expanding around, in the company part of this framework, the organizational structure. So is there something you could do as an organizationally to minimize that? So if the cultures are very different, for example, you might hypothesize, well, maybe you want to just keep them apart. Let's not have them share offices, right? And it can be sort of an independent arm with more of a arm's length relationship. If the culture fit is better, you might want to merge them. So those are sort of some different branches you could go to. I haven't seen that happen too much. This is usually tends to be where the most common variation on this is a capacity issue. So if it's a high fixed cost industry, they'll say, well, given this acquisition, if it were a high fixed cost industry, what would happen to market prices? Okay? If you merge and consolidated factories or whatever. And then that becomes a shift to the supply and demand framework. Okay? So you can see how this example we sort of evolved from literally every case we talked about. And the key is there's always sort of one piece of interesting data that's the aha that says, okay, we're clearly going in a different direction. And that sort of tends to be the trigger. So I tend to do that intuitively, but hopefully I mentioned enough times so you can sort of get it, right? Any questions on that? Yes?
So you went from competition to customers.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like you could have gone from, say, competition to products to say, what are my current product offerings? Does that overlap with the high growth?
Absolutely.
So
both are right.
effectively, you could have gone either way.
Yes. Many ways to be right.
And also, when you're looking at aha moments, it seems like when you get that aha moment, like you could pretty much just narrow the focus really quick.
Absolutely.
And it seemed like you still went through, customer, product, and company. Was that just an exercise for us to get familiar with?
Not always. What I might say, if I'm not sure, is I would say, well, it looks like this is the real issue. Right. But just to cover my bases, I'm going to ask a few more questions just to make sure. And then I might say, I think you got it right. Why don't we move on? Okay, so that's their feedback, like, no, you got it. Keep going. I don't want to waste time on that. Okay. And sometimes they might let you struggle a little bit and then tell you to move on. So there's a variety of whatever they want to do. But generally, because in a typical actual consulting engagement, there's sort of no right answer, because you need to know all of this stuff at some point. So whether you do it on a Monday or a Thursday, what's the big deal, as long as you get it all by Friday. So a lot of ways to be right, and that's a very reasonable approach to do, too. Yeah. Yes, the back.
Well, you said that the fact that there's no overlap between the customers is
Mm-hmm.
good. I understand in this case, but in general, wouldn't you say that if there's no overlap, the cross-selling opportunity is not there? So what profiles of the customers so that you can cross-sell. If you're selling, let's say, shirt, right, and you're buying a company that makes pants, if those customers, they don't like the products, the other products, how are you going to sell and create those synergy, sales synergy?
If there's no overlap, that's a good point. In that situation, I would say the benefit to Omega and Omega and this acquisition, the value does not come from the synergy of cross-selling, which may be minimal in this case, if that's indeed the case. The value really is participating in a market segment that's probably going to dominate, and Omega and Omega is being left behind. And this is a faster way to participate in that market than to build it yourself.
In general, would you say there should be some overlap?
In general. In general, there's no general. Honestly, it varies an awful lot. You can do it a lot. There's a lot of ways to justify an acquisition and reasons why not to do one. And you may find a situation where you don't have that particular synergy, but there's another one that's more valuable, so it might still be worth doing. So there's, in terms of how you interpret it, there's no hard and fast rule. It really does vary on the situation.